I'm King Lincoln. This week we're going to be looking at Death Stranding. This was originally on the PlayStation 4, it's now come to PC, so it's time to talk about it. Though I do have to have a little disclaimer here. So, I worked at Sony for about 6 years, left them about 2 years ago. I want to be upfront about this because you should know if there's any potential bias, but I can say that I don't believe there is. This is just for you to best judge my content. And I actually started this channel when I was at Sony just because I wanted to do something creative on my own. The odd thing was I chose Steam because Sony wasn't at all on PC, and sure enough, now they've come to PC. Don't know what to do about that. But let's get to the other side of the story. While Death Stranding was published by 505 Games on PC, the IP still appears to be fully owned by Sony, at least the last I heard. You'll see Sony's name in the opening credits on screen, so this was as Sony a game as you'll see on PC. At least it was until Horizon Zero Dawn came out last week. We'll talk about that one before long too, I think. Death Stranding, though, is the latest from Hideo Kojima, who is famous for the Metal Gear Solid series published by Konami. After his very public falling out with Konami, the real question is, can his next project live up to the fame of Metal Gear? I'm going to just give you the quick spoiler. I don't know if it has, but I also think the game starts to explain some of the issues that occurred with the development of Metal Gear Solid 5. I'm going to break Death Stranding up into two parts. I'm going to call it the gameplay and the story, which does give away what I'm going to be talking about, but stick with me here. That's just the driving force of each section of Death Stranding. Now, let's start this with the common criticism against Death Stranding. A lot of people use the reductive statement of Death Stranding being a walking simulator. Truthfully, I do see where they're coming from. More than 75% of my time with Death Stranding was spent moving between locations and delivering packages. I actually often call this game DoorDash Simulator because you spend most of your time delivering stuff to random people's homes. And yes, in 2020, parts of this game feel a little bit too relevant at times. Not everything is walking in the game, but I wanted to bring up one interesting part of Death Stranding. The opening hours of Death Stranding start to challenge the player immediately. It's not just walking that's important here, but staying upright, especially when you're carrying a large load, and much of Death Stranding is about balancing your cargo and avoiding falling over. I think in a lot of ways, this actually reminds me of QWOP, or QWOP by Bennett Foley. That little game where you try to make a runner dash 100 meters and likely will fail every time. I know I do. Now, QWOP would not make a very fun game, especially one that's going to take more than a few seconds to play. However, Death Stranding does something similar in making the walking part of the game challenging, so it keeps the attention of the player as they move through the early parts of the game. If you ignore the way Sam, the main character, leans, he will fall over, and items take a small amount of damage, not too much. This isn't intended to be an impossible challenge, but the early hours of Death Stranding make just traversing a map interesting. I could feel myself understanding how the system worked, and something is interesting and wonderful about how the game handles larger objects and then later will mitigate those challenges in a few ways. With that said, much of Death Stranding is as you've already seen. You're going to walk through rather beautiful and massive vistas and enjoy delivering packages to shelters. Those shelters, though, are a bit of a bummer. The story is that characters are afraid to go to the surface due to disasters. The player may see a few other porters, meaning delivery men, but most people hide in underground bunkers. The problem is, it doesn't matter the size of a bunker. 100,000 person city can feel the same as a single prepper's location because there's really not much to see in either place. There's a larger area of pavement and sometimes a walled off location, but that's about it. The world of Death Stranding probably could have been just about 10% more interesting. I understand that the world is dystopian and destroyed, but it feels a little too sterile. There are story reasons for this, of course. There also are a couple interesting parts of the world remaining. Finding a few more destroyed locations, maybe a couple locations that aren't on the actual main mission path other than, a few prepper locations, would have been more interesting. So I think we can say that the moniker of Walking Simulator does describe Death Stranding. However, I think it's time we retire that term. You see, Walking Simulator is about as descriptive as a first-person game. It says nothing about the game you're discussing other than a main mechanic, walking. Yet, every game has a character walking in some fashion. It's like reducing every amazing game into just first person or third person. Even just calling Resident Evil a third person shooter doesn't do it justice. I mean, yes, it is certainly true for Resident Evil 2, but it's not a helpful description of what happens in the game, whereas survival horror as a genre is much more specific and helpful. While I know a lot of people love first-person shooters, calling both Deus Ex and Call of Duty simply an FPS tells us nothing about those games. So rather than calling these games walking simulators, let's start calling these games exploration games, because at the heart of Death Stranding, the core gameplay is going to be exploration. You're going to want to hear and understand the story. You want to experience Death Stranding for everything you can, and you'll do all of that while you explore the world. And if you dislike walking simulators, you're not going to suddenly like exploration games, but at least it's describing the core mechanic of the game. I also know some people call them first-person adventure games, but it just doesn't do it for me. Also, Death Stranding uses a third-person view, so of course that's not going to work. I'd argue adventure games are more about the adventure itself, something more like Zelda or Kami. Exploration, though, is what Death Stranding is about, for the most part. The mission structure is mostly about delivering cargo to the next location, and I find the main mission structure rather enjoyable. There's a very chill feeling as you play through Death Stranding. Sometimes beautiful music will pop up at different points as you travel. The system is very well done, and hearing one of those songs feels rewarding, but honestly, I also wish there was a simple music player or radio station to let the players have some tunes on the various trips. This is something that I think Metal Gear Solid 5 did far better, and it seems like a very missed opportunity. Also, much of Death Stranding doesn't have a real danger about it. Your goal is to get from point A to point B, and you're going to get there one step at a time. But even when there is an intended obstacle or danger in Death Stranding, I really hesitate to call it a real danger. I found I was able to run away from every encounter except for maybe 5 of them in the entire game. Even when Death Stranding pushes the idea of stealth, action, or some tactics to avoid the danger, it does it in such a weak way that the player can almost ignore it. That's not to say there's no action or danger or even interesting occurrences. It's just that Death Stranding struggles to make it feel like a major part of its gameplay. Throughout a 60-hour game, I probably had to continue less than 5 times. It's not that hard of a game, and that's using a limited amount of stealth. You literally can just flee from almost every encounter in Death Stranding, as you can run faster or be more evasive than the enemy here, even when everything's going wrong. Yet, I found myself enjoying the aspect of getting from point A to point B, especially when Death Stranding started to layer in the ideas of power armor and vehicles, as well as allowing an online system that shares pieces of your world with other people so you can help traverse the land. I have more to say about this, but it's just stuff that happens. The core of the gameplay is just getting around. There's a lot of interesting systems, and very similar to Metal Gear Solid 5, there are huge systems that players can choose to ignore safely. The EX grenades, for instance, are never necessary. There are also full gameplay systems that players may never discover. I'll leave it to players to find out what happens if you kill a human and then leave them laying around, but it's not something that came up in my game, even if it is an interesting system. I do also want to call out the like system, which is the one gameplay system I feel a little weird with. You earn likes by taking any task and then completing them, or even sharing that task with other people online. It's an interesting way to play Death Stranding, and there's a bit of commentary on social media here by way of game design. It's a clever system, but eventually it devolves into the fact that likes is just another name for experience points and levels. There's nothing really wrong with this system, but I don't think Death Stranding does enough to drive home why it chose likes or what its commentary on it is, instead of just using experience or faction points or some other generic term. Now, to avoid making this video an hour-long dissection of Death Stranding, I'm going to move on to the story, which will take quite a bit of time as well. I'm going to heavily avoid talking about spoilers in regard to the story, outside of maybe the first 2 or 3 hours here, because spoilers are 90% of a Kojima story. Now, this is firmly a Kojima game with Kojima's brand of weirdness and Kojima style all over it. And if you buckle up for the ride, you're going to have a pretty good time. Though, a little advice: don't look up any information on any characters until you finish the entire game of Death Stranding. I actually got spoiled twice, so just trust in Kojima to give you an absolute rollercoaster ride of a story that players expect from him due to the Metal Gear Solid franchise, and he will likely answer almost all your questions. Now, as much as I enjoy Kojima's brand of storytelling, I also think there are some flaws with the story in Death Stranding. You see, our main character is Sam Porter Bridges. Sam has already existed in this world for decades by this point, and does have a bit of a backstory. People in the world also have some concept of what a Death Stranding is. Or rather, they don't, but there is a base level of understanding that is known for what that terminology means. And yet, this simple understanding of the terminology is kept from the player for most of the game. Even Death Stranding itself constantly refers to the enemies, which are called BTs, but never decides to sit down and even explain the current understanding of BTs, however limited it would be. The name itself means beached things, and I don't even know if the game makes that clear. But a simple 5-minute scene at the beginning of Death Stranding explaining the current state of the world could have been useful at some point in the over 60 hours the game will take. And yes, there are data logs that you are seeing on screen, but even these are not clear about the topics. A simple dictionary or encyclopedia would have been very useful early on in the game so you could look up many of the terms that the game just drops. It's not even the world building that has issues. The main story is unnecessarily confusing, and characters constantly talk in odd ways to make players think the wrong thing. A simple version of this in the first hour is when Sam is invited to meet the president, with invited being a very generous term at this point. The president wants to see you, come meet the president. When you walk into that room, you get a surprise. Sam is actually the president's son. And I'm using this very specific example because it's in the first hour of Death Stranding. There are a lot of examples of this in the story where they tend to bury the lead for hours on purpose. Quite often it feels like what BTs are, or what Death Stranding is, could have been made more interesting by a generic and potentially incorrect explanation early on in the story, with a lot of holes that players would wonder what is missing from their knowledge. Instead, for most of Death Stranding, I wondered if I had missed a critical scene somewhere that explained the current knowledge base of the world. And it's so much better for a player to be wondering about the story and considering it than wondering if he's missed the story and if your game had made a mistake. But even without the clear beginning, the story is what kept me playing Death Stranding. I might have played the game for about 10 hours with that uber chill gameplay, but with the story, I was following along for 60 hours because I kept wanting to know what was going on with most of the characters. There are many interesting characters here, from the enigmatic Fragile, a female porter, to Deathman, who befriends Sam early on. There's also Heartman, Mama, and more. And while I could explain these names for you, you must trust in Kojima, for he has reasons for each of these names and characters. Without spoilers, though, I can't dive much more into the heart of the story, but I will say that I think Death Stranding is a strong entry from the way it tells its story. The only real problem is the length. There's a two-part reveal to Fragile's backstory in Death Stranding, for example. She tells half of her story, and then the player will eventually get the next chunk of story, a couple story missions later. And the problem is, that chunk of gameplay can be anywhere from 2 hours to 8 hours, depending on how much time the player takes between the deliveries for the main story. There's a decent amount of side deliveries that the player can get into, and the fact is, the way Fragile ends the first chunk of story just feels sudden, so it's odd that it just decides, oh, later on, here's the rest of my story. When Metal Gear Solid actually had similar huge overarching story, there were mostly linear gameplay systems that would take the player between 10 to 20 hours, with nuggets of information and story appearing multiple times over each of these hours. But stretching that same story over 40 hours, such as in Metal Gear Solid 5, or even 60 in Death Stranding, takes the player out of the narrative, so no matter how compelling it is, they're a little bit lagged. And it doesn't help in scenes like this where there's a 10-minute car ride in Metal Gear Solid 5. A quick side note, because we are talking about both Death Stranding and Metal Gear Solid 5, I think Fragile as a character is handled much better than Metal Gear Solid 5's Quiet, both in terms of outfit and story. Quiet is interesting, but I think most fans will agree her nudity really feels forced in. Listen, Kojima, if you want a sexy woman in your game who is barely clothed, I'll support that fully, that is your choice, but don't try to just rationalize it this way. Back to thinking about the story's delivery. There's just a problem with the slow, methodical gameplay that Death Stranding offers. While that does allow the player to contemplate what's going on in the story and world, this could have been the right place for podcast-style exposition, such as what was in Metal Gear Solid 5. That's not available here. Instead, the long treks punctuate the main story, or rather, I should say the story punctuates the gameplay. The slow gameplay hinders some of the storytelling, and this made me start to question the real issues that occurred back in Metal Gear Solid 5. I think much of Metal Gear Solid 5's issues are blamed on Konami's interference, and that is probably true. But I also think the style of open-world gameplay Metal Gear Solid 5 went for doesn't work well with the story that it would try to tell. Even if Metal Gear Solid 5's narrative was fully fleshed out and perfect, spending 5 to 10 hours without any story adding to the narrative is detrimental to the pacing of the game. And that same fact is true for Death Stranding. Though when you think about Death Stranding, Metal Gear Solid, and much of Kojima's work, it excels because he is an auteur. You can see his hand in every part of Metal Gear Solid and Death Stranding, and that makes his work stand out because it is his singular vision. Kojima is a storyteller, and every aspect works to tell that same story. And with that said, perhaps I should admit that I might be wrong in my criticism of how the story is delivered. I absolutely get the feeling that Death Stranding will stay with me for decades, while other games I actually played at the same time, such as Assassin's Creed Rogue or Shadow Warrior, their stories have already faded before a single month was up. Maybe there is something about how Kojima delivered this story to make it resonate more with the player. There's one last issue, though, I have with Death Stranding, and it's something that kind of bothered me over the course of the game. By now, everyone knows Norman Reedus, Mads Mikkelsen, and even Guillermo del Toro appear in Death Stranding. Our main character is Norman Reedus. Yes, his name is Sam Porter, but look at him. I mean, he's Norman Reedus. Before I go on, though, let me be absolutely clear. Everyone here turned in a top-notch performance for Death Stranding. The experience is unlike anything else. Mads Mikkelsen made me care about a character you mostly see snippets of. Norman Reedus' work is exceptional, and the technology to bring him to life is unparalleled. I would dare say we even have surpassed the uncanny valley with this game that developers have been afraid of for game development for so long. Yet my problem is, by surpassing the issues, we've created the next problem. If you look at Death Stranding as either a movie or a TV show, there's not a strong reason for Norman Reedus to look like Norman Reedus. In movies, we applaud characters for their superior acting ability, especially when they feel like they've become the character. Gary Oldman is one of my favorite actors because I can see him in 10 roles and see 10 different and unique characters. Daniel Day-Lewis becomes the character to such a high degree, the actor is hidden in his performances. The movie industry is also willing to spend millions of dollars to hide their famous actors. They take the gorgeous Karen Gillan and make her into Nebula, or perhaps take Hugo Weaving, who's very identifiable, and turn him into the Red Skull. The point I'm trying to make, though, is the height of acting isn't the recreation of a recognizable actor, but rather the ability to allow an actor to hide in a role or performance and to help create the illusion. The problem is, Death Stranding doesn't do this. It doesn't even attempt it. Norman Reedus is intended to look exactly like Norman Reedus. Mads Mikkelsen looks exactly like Mads Mikkelsen. And I realize part of this is showing the level of technology that we have reached. As mentioned before, I have some understanding of the face scan technology that Sony has available due to working on MLB The Show, and it is unbelievable. But this is one impressive game that just shows the tech. The tech is solid, but it becomes very noticeable, and it really doesn't help the story. If I'm going to compare this to Metal Gear Solid and any character in that entire series, I find the characters in Metal Gear Solid to be more visually interesting because they're designed by artists rather than being a simple recreation of a very real famous person. Many games do use facial models, of course, and this is not my issue. The issue I have here is they're using a well-known face. This will also be an issue for me when we reach Cyberpunk. Now, I love Keanu Reeves, Bill and Ted, John Wick, and of course the first Matrix movie. They're all amazing. But I don't think seeing Keanu Reeves in Cyberpunk is really going to bring me further into the world of Cyberpunk, especially so far in the future. The thing is, recreating actors is a major issue. It has worked previously, such as on LA Noire, though I think it should be done sparingly. However, the idea of acting in film is about hiding oneself and putting on a mask. No offense to Die Hardman here. As a developer, it might be better to take more artistic license with the recreation and give the actors a better persona to hide behind. Though with saying that, well, I feel like we have to discuss the Monster Energy drink. Now, I understand Kojima's penchant for layering in real elements into his game, even including himself. He did this multiple times in Metal Gear Solid, and I can understand why he uses the real faces of the actors because of that, even if I disagree with it. But the Monster Energy drink doesn't fit in with Death Stranding, and it is a major gameplay element. The biggest issue for me, though, is it's one of the only pieces of modern signage that remains. I enjoy Monster Energy drink personally, it's reasonably tasty for what it is. The problem, though, is there's so little of modern culture anywhere in Death Stranding that exists, where Monster just feels completely out of place. There were a few solutions they could use for this. They easily could have got more sponsorships, so you might see signs of other brands, though in a dystopian future presented, I can't imagine many companies signing on to have like a burnt out Wendy's sign as you walk past. Now, they could have gone farther with it and made a special Monster Energy drink flavor specifically for Death Stranding, giving it a unique sign that fits in with the game. Though, considering a big part of the drinking attribute allows you to create items from your piss and then use those as piss grenades, yeah, I think that association might have been awkward if it was brought to market. And the final possibility, they could and probably should have skipped the inclusion of Monster Energy drinks altogether. The problem is not advertising. Listen, games are already advertising to people, movies do this all the time, it really isn't always out of place. But the Monster Energy drink here doesn't fit in with the work. This feels much more like Mac and Me than E.T. Ultimately, though, I enjoyed my time with Death Stranding, and I do like to chill out with the game and enjoy the atmosphere delivered. I did enjoy the story, especially when I reached the end of the game, and I do think I understand most of it, even if it was stretched out over too much filler gameplay. I also enjoyed that filler gameplay even after the story was done, so both sides were done well. I do also have to bring up again that many of the issues I had with Death Stranding are actually issues I had with Metal Gear Solid 5 and I didn't realize. I think in some ways Death Stranding helped me to come to terms with the issues I had outside of the final missing chapters of Metal Gear Solid 5. The realization that it's not just the story that had issues, but rather how that story was told, and the same problems sadly still exist here. I enjoyed both Death Stranding and Metal Gear Solid 5, but in both games, I think the two parts of the game don't fully fit together. The story of Death Stranding needs to be in the game half the length, and the gameplay needs to be in an unscripted world with more to see, and the same is true for Metal Gear Solid 5. I picked up Death Stranding for about $60. I think that price might be a little bit too high, but I would recommend Death Stranding when it drops to around $30 to $40, maybe even $20. It's well worth it to see what Kojima has in store for us in the post-Konami world. I honestly can't wait to see his next delivery. And a quick note here, the video on the screen actually happened as I was recording just past midnight when it became my birthday. I wasn't sure what the scene was about, and then I figured it out. It was just such a great touch for this game. I have to give props for it. It gave me a goofy grin. It gave me a second one even when I replayed it for my wife. Such a nice touch. That's what I have for Death Stranding. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, consider clicking the subscribe button or the bell or leaving a comment. You can even consider that your birthday present to me. I'd appreciate that. Now, for a small channel update, I am going to be putting out these design reviews every other week, skipping the Humble Choice weeks, of course. I think it'll allow me to produce better content and be less rushed with them. I will be writing more just standard written reviews for games on Steam and my website because, truthfully, I love writing. I'll leave a link to the website in the description. Feel free to sign up as you see on screen to see what I'll be writing about if you prefer the written word. If you want more though, I'm going to be popping up my design review of Hitman 2, which is another game with a large number of gameplay systems and interesting interactions between them, something every Kojima game has shown. I'll also be putting up my review for Metal Gear Solid 5 because I think that's a game that is heavily undervalued due to story reasons, but it's still a fantastic game even if it is not perfect. And until then, I am King Link, and thank you for watching.